Hello and welcome to another confined edition of The World This Week. The World This Week in partnership with The Daily Beast. Foreign editor Christopher Dickey is with us from the French capital. How are you?
Good, good. Holding out. It seems okay.
Week 5.
I've lost count.
All right. I've been keeping count. Anna Nemtsova, the Daily Beast correspondent in Moscow, joins us. How are you?
Hi. I'm okay. Missing my traveling and missing my friends, but so far it's been going well.
All right, let's ask Delphine Minouy if she's getting stir crazy. Istanbul correspondent for Le Figaro, the author of the book Collectors, a band of Syrian rebels and the stories that carried them through a war. That comes out in English later this year.
Hello, good afternoon, good evening. I'm talking from Istanbul, where we are facing a total lockdown for the weekend, third time in a month.
A total lockdown. We'll be talking more about that. And you could contrast that with Gothenburg, Sweden, where Paris correspondent for the newspaper Aftonbladet, Johanna Frenden, is with us. We'll be asking you why there's no lockdown whatsoever where you are. How are you?
I'm good. Very well. Happy to be able to go outside.
All right. You have us all jealous. We'll be talking more about that. By
I
the way,
know.
you can weigh in on the conversation on Facebook and Twitter. The hashtag is World This Week. And well, let's begin with the most important news of the week.
I'm a ghost, living in a ghost town. I'm a ghost, living in a ghost town.
Yeah, so the Rolling Stones putting out their first single since 2012. I noticed, Christopher Dickey, the top YouTube comment on that video is, quote, "The vaccine is within Keith's DNA."
Yeah, well, I think they also have been pretty heavy smokers. We are hearing that nicotine is probably a good counteractive. Maybe marijuana works against it too. And who knows what works against it? Probably not hydrochloroquine, however.
All right, there's a bit of premonition there in that the video, of course, is brand new, but the song was recorded a year ago, and that's what's got a lot of people talking. Christopher, on your Instagram account, there's a picture you took a few days back of the Arc de Triomphe, and gosh, it really is a ghost town.
Yeah, it really is. That was about a week ago, a little less than a week ago. Fairly early in the morning, I think about 8:30 in the morning, and there really was just nobody on the Champs-Élysées, nobody around the Arc de Triomphe, maybe one or two people you could see. In the middle of the day and a weekday, it tends to be a little bit more than that. But what I noticed the last time I went out, which was yesterday, I didn't go up there, but I was walking around town a little bit. It seems to me a lot more people are out on the street now, and a lot fewer of them are wearing masks, partly because it's spring, it's so beautiful, people want to open up. I think also they're just jumping the gun. I think that they've heard that the lockdown is going to end, even though it will be progressive on May 11th, and they're sort of saying, well, it's such a beautiful day. Let's get out, let's walk around, let's see the sights. So I think as we get closer to May 11th, we'll see more and more people in the Étoile around the Arc de Triomphe, but also just out on the streets here in Paris and throughout France.
Yeah, the French president has set this date of May 11th for the beginning of deconfinement. I know in neighboring Germany, they're starting much earlier. Deconfinement is what everyone's waiting for, especially with the beautiful weather we've been having here that you were talking about, Christopher. It's a tricky one. We're seeing, for instance, the Toyota car factory in the north of France has already opened up. But the question is, can they really open up schools? Can they really open up public transport? It's tricky.
Well, I think it's very tricky. I think, if you really want to look at the key to the spread of this disease, it's all about population density. If you have lots of people crammed close together and some of them are carriers, and we now think it's inevitable that a high percentage of people will be carriers, then their disease is going to spread. That's what it amounts to. If you open up the subways, how are you going to have social distancing in subway cars? It's not clear at all. if you open up bars and restaurants, are people going to be able to sit at the bar? That's not going to be very good. So I think all kinds of measures are going to have to be taken if they're going to keep the infection rate down.
Over in Istanbul, quite a different story, Delphine Minoui. Your cover story in Le Figaro earlier this week talked about how Turkey's most populous city was effectively a ghost town. I noticed you posted pictures of cats that seem to have taken over the city.
Yes, the cats definitely seem to be the new rulers, the new sultans of the city, especially during the weekends. Since President Erdogan decided to impose every weekend a total lockdown, which means no one at all is allowed to go to the streets. Public transportations are not working. As you can see on these pictures, the restaurants, the cafes, everything is closed. You can just meet cats in the streets, sometimes dogs and seagulls, and that's about it. During the week, it's a different story. The government has bet on keeping, as President Erdogan says, keeping the wheels of the economy turning. So factories are still functioning, certain companies are still functioning. Instead, the government has relied more on wearing masks. It's mandatory. You have to wear a mask anytime you go to into a bus during the week, or you go to the supermarket. There are big restrictions also regarding social distancing, and there's an age restriction. If you're under 20 or above 65, you're not allowed at all to go out of your house. That's how it's going on these days in Istanbul. But it feels, yes, so strange for a city which never sleeps, which is always booming all the time. Whenever you put your feet out in the streets, it feels so. It's my vision of the end of the world. That's what I mentioned in my article.
And your article concludes with your worry, because you wrote the piece at the beginning of the week about what it would be like with the beginning of Ramadan. And it's here now. It's the first day of Ramadan. What's it like?
Yes, I mean, it's really tough for the families. The month of Ramadan is a month of family gathering. Everybody visits their relatives, their loved ones in their houses every day at the end of the fast, to break the fast. So it's a total different flavor. It's really tough. It's challenging. So people who can afford it, of course, rely on, as you in France, rely on Zoom gatherings and like talking through the winter. But I think that is totally unprecedented as well in Turkey, as well as other Muslim countries. The mosques are totally closed. There's no mosque. So it's really, I mean, it's becoming the new normal, but it's so surreal.
Let me ask you about that, because we did a show on Thursday about Ramadan and COVID-19. And in Turkey, they're respecting the rules. In Iran, they're respecting the rules. In Saudi Arabia, they're respecting the rules. In Pakistan and Afghanistan, the mosques are open. Your thoughts on that, Delphine?
Yes, indeed. I mean, it's the case in some Muslim countries, but also in Catholic countries where the spread of the coronavirus was increased because of certain religious gatherings. I mean, you have clerics, you have priests, you have different leaders of different religious communities who up to now keep on insisting that coronavirus is made up in Israel or in the US, and you shouldn't follow what the TV is saying. It's so dangerous. I mean, thankfully, it's not the case in Turkey, where most of the people are trying to be responsible and trying to follow the rules, or at least to listen to what the doctors are saying.
All right, well, here to spite us, as we said at the outset, is Johanna Frenden. No lockdown whatsoever since the beginning?
No lockdown. I mean, all the measures that have been taken in Sweden, almost all of them are voluntarily. Of course, you cannot reassemble more than 50 people at the moment. And some of the bigger factories like Volvo, for example, have been closed for a while. But everything remains more or less open. You can go to a restaurant. You cannot sit in the bar. Actually, bar service is not allowed. So there are, some details have changed, and people are encouraged to keep social distance.
And have you yourself been to a restaurant? Have you?
People go to. The restaurants are losing a lot of money, obviously, because people are scared, and also they're not allowed to keep, to welcome as many people as they normally would. Now that the weather and the temperature is rising, there have been the question of closing some terraces has been raised, because apparently people aren't that cautious in, when you get a spot in the sun, people tend to, stick together and not keep the distance so much. So that has been the big issue. In fact, today the government said that if we keep having a problem with the terraces, the outdoor restaurants, we might have to close them. But the idea and the policy of the Swedish government has been to follow the advice from the public sanity or public health board, and at the same time try and keep the wheels turning to avoid, this huge economic backlash, basically.
So you heard Christopher Dickey at the outset say the reason why lockdown measures are more or less strict, depending on what part of Europe you're in, often has to do with population density. Is that how you see it?
You know what? I think it's a mixture between Swedish people in general having extreme high confidence in the authorities and in its administration. For example, the vaccination program in Swedish is completely voluntary, yet 98% of the people do vaccinate their children, against different diseases, which is, the numbers are a lot lower in the south of Europe, for example. So they're appealing, I guess, to the common sense of the people, and the Swedes have so far responded pretty well. There has been, the numbers of travels during the Easter holiday, because the government said, please don't go anywhere if you don't really have to. So people would start saying, what does it mean? Maybe I have to see my friends or whatever. In the end, 90% of the travels in Sweden were actually stopped, or voluntarily. People refrained from going away, even though they had tickets, on the train or the boat or whatever. So it has worked quite well in that sense. Obviously more people die in Sweden than in the neighboring countries, because there have been lockdowns in schools and such in Denmark and in Norway and Finland, not to speak. So it's a bit mitigated, obviously the
people don't mind the higher death toll in Sweden.
Excuse me?
People don't mind the fact that there's a higher death toll than in neighboring countries in Sweden?
There is criticism as well, of course. I think it has been quite well explained, that this policy or this theory. Basically, what they are telling us is that this virus is here to stay. There is no way we can close down a society for up to 2 years, or how long it will take to get people to get the vaccine. So we will have to face it this way, and we will. The most important thing is to protect the old, and people who are ill, who are in risk groups for different reasons. That has not worked so well. As in most countries in Europe, there have been a lot of cases in older people's homes, for example. So that's the big issue, and there is criticism, of course. Now, understanding that Stockholm, the region of Stockholm, will probably reach this famous herd immunity in May, end of May, encourages people, I think, to be cautious, but still not be, panicking, because it seems that on the other side of May, things might get easier, because that many people will be immune in the capital area of Sweden, that in fact you can start moving around almost as usually, but it doesn't really help the old or the risk groups. We'll still have to protect them.
Before I turn to Anna Nemtsova, Christopher Dickey, just a quick word. Who's right? Norway, which opted for confinement, or Sweden, which never opted for confinement?
Well, I was just looking at the numbers, not so much for Norway, but if you count the number of deaths per million people, the US, which now has a huge number of deaths, only has 152 per million. Sweden has 200 per million. It's had over 2,000 deaths, and it's got a pretty small population. So you're gambling essentially that there will be herd immunity. But the problem is we don't know that there really is any significant immunity with this particular disease because it is so new. It could easily be a case where you get very brief immunity or virtually none.
And
so
that
in that case, this would have been not a great effort. And if you look at the UK, for instance, it's now got 276 dead per million, a total of 18,738 deaths. And that was the country that first started talking about herd immunity before finally they realized their entire healthcare system would be overwhelmed. So I think there's the idea of herd immunity is a great idea. I hope it works. If it doesn't, then a lot of people will have died.
All right. We saw in Russia how at first the scale of the possible pandemic there was played down. The authorities, though, have changed their message 180 degrees. Let's listen to President Vladimir Putin speaking last weekend.
Все уровни власти работают ритмично, организованно, ответственно. Ситуация находится под полным контролем. Все наше общество объединяется перед общей угрозой.
Anna Nemtsova, how's Russia doing? How's Vladimir Putin doing?
Well, I'm in Moscow, a city of more than 12 million people, the city of traffic jams and huge crowds on the streets. Moscow is a ghost town today. I can see no pedestrians in my street, almost no vehicles. There are quite a few cameras around my block that are watching everybody. These cameras can recognize your face, even if you are wearing a balaclava, if you completely cover your face. These are smart cameras. So this state, Russia is a state of police and civilians. And people are afraid of going out without QR codes that we are supposed to obtain online by giving authorities all our personal information. But there is another thing. Before the coronavirus crisis, before the pandemic, Russian opposition were under a lot of pressure. All Putin critics were under a lot of police pressure. And now every household knows what it is like to be watched, to be controlled. But on the other hand, no matter how problematic this police state is, many people hope, knowing their traditional character of fatalism. We had a story about Russian fatalism recently on the Daily Beast. People hope that that might work, that harsh control might work. And also you separate Moscow, you look at Moscow separately from the rest of the country. As Putin uses a very interesting, very typical tactics. Before, when it was some tragedy, some fire or floods, Putin would appear on front lines and make decisions or make orders. Today, Putin delegates authority to the regions. So in case we see huge death toll in the future, people would blame their governors, their regional leaders, and not Vladimir Putin.
By the way, Anna, that's been the same here in France, where France has a very top-down system. Emmanuel Macron's self-styled Jupiterian presidency coming under pressure with this crisis, and he made big political hay out of the fact that he was meeting with mayors, that he was going to try as much as possible to cater the response to this crisis and the beginning of deconfinement to what is decided at the local level. Is it just a political tactic, what you're describing, or is it the realization that, well, you've got to govern differently in this crisis?
Absolutely. This is a vast country with dozens and dozens of regions in far north, in Siberia, in Far East. Moscow cannot really control every step in Far East, in Vladivostok. So unfortunately, there are no tests. If we talk about numbers, we cannot really see the real situation because many regions lack proper tests. Most of the numbers we see, over 60,000 diagnosed with coronavirus, are in Moscow. So Moscow hospitals are all full with patients. We see traffic jams of ambulances. But to be honest with you, since we speak with doctors, we see people's reaction on social media. I don't think that the Kremlin is covering up thousands of deaths. Maybe there are misdiagnosing of hundreds of deaths. They present it as somebody dying from heart disease and not from corona. But so far, we are still, far away from the curve. Nobody is talking about opening the country.
Nobody's talking about opening the country.
Not
Delphine Minouis, you heard Johanna Freunden describe a country where people have complete trust in their public health services. In fact, basically delegating the responsibility of what's open, what's closed to government civil servants. And the case of other countries where there's a mistrust of authority. Your thoughts on that?
Well, in a country like Turkey, where the media is under a lot of pressure from the government, definitely there's a lot of censorship going on. I mean, you can read it through the social media. You have cases of journalists who have been trying to investigate what's going on, who have been under pressure. Some of them are even under the pressure from the justice. So definitely some Turkish reporters, some experts are suggesting that the figures may be more higher than what they are. But I would say that the main focus on the social media is about the mismanagement at the very beginning. Turkey is neighbor with Iran, where the coronavirus spread out very quickly. Turkey is a hub. You have a lot of Chinese businessmen, Chinese tourists coming to the country. But Turkey just woke up mid-March, while the pandemic was already spreading apparently at least beginning mid-February. You have also to take into account all these pilgrims who went to Mecca, and thousands of people who came back, no investigations, nothing, and they just went all around the country, went back to their families, to their villages, and that's how it started. So people are definitely blaming the government for taking measures too late, definitely too late. That's why numbers are still increasing now. We've reached more than 2,000 people in terms of the death toll regarding the coronavirus.
Chris Verdicki, there are leaders adopting more of a low profile, like Vladimir Putin. Anna Nemtsova just described it. And then there are those who've disappeared completely from the public eye, like North Korea's Kim Jong-un.
Well, yes, that's true. And we've been following that very closely because obviously it would shake things up dramatically in that part of Asia, and frankly, internationally, on a global level, if Kim Jong-un should suddenly disappear. It appears that he's, there's every reason to believe he's not in good health. And it appears that his baby sister, who's 31 years old, Kim Yo-jong, is being positioned to take his place if indeed he expires. He weighs about 300 pounds. He's only 5 feet 7 inches tall. Apparently he smokes and drinks quite a bit and works very hard. So he's a great candidate for all kinds of diseases. It wouldn't be a surprise if he was hospitalized for a while. It would be a surprise if he dies. It's also conceivable that he's contracted COVID-19, which is something that no single case of that has been admitted so far, and certainly no death has been admitted so far in North Korea, even though people think it probably is rampant there. So we don't know what's happening in North Korea. We do know that that Kim Yo-jong, the 31-year-old sister, is the most likely successor, and a lot of people are now suddenly very interested in what she is all about.
All right. I sound sorry, Chris, a bit like a broken record, but every week the rest of the world is, well, surprised when we listen to these White House press conferences. Let's listen to Donald Trump on Thursday.
supposing we hit the body with a tremendous, whether it's ultraviolet or just very powerful light, and I think you said that hasn't been checked, but you're going to test it. And then I said, supposing you brought the light inside the body, which you can do either through the skin or in some other way. And I think you said you're going to test that too. Sounds interesting. Right, and then I see the disinfectant where it knocks it out in a minute, 1 minute. And is there a way we can do something like that?
Where do we begin with that one, Chris?
Well, as any of Trump's admirers will tell you, he loves to think out loud. But in a situation like this, thinking out loud like that is completely nuts. Because there will be people who will listen to that and they'll think, oh yeah, I should inject some, household disinfectant into my veins or swallow some, which will almost certainly kill them immediately and very painfully. Or maybe he thinks that his tanning bed is a great way to fight coronaviruses, that you should just get lots of UV radiations, which will, among other things, will probably give you skin cancer, but that's not going to affect the coronavirus that way. The briefing that came before that was how to disinfect surfaces, how to keep coronavirus from surviving on door handles or on clothes, not how to keep it from surviving inside the human organism. But he turned to his experts, and poor souls that they are, poor sycophants that they've become, they nodded and go, oh yeah, you said you wanted that tested. We'll test that. If this is a very, very sad situation.
Let me bring in Johanna Frenden on this. Johanna, what do Swedes make of it when they hear stuff like this?
Well, I guess that somehow in this kind of crisis, the national stereotypes tend to be a little bit reinforced, right? And I think that at the moment, looking at the States and the theater, the circus at the White House, kind of gives other countries a bit of a confidence, to be honest, because at least you can point at Donald Trump and say, okay, at least we don't have a lunatic in charge. And no matter how much we fail or succeed in this crisis, if you can even succeed in it, it's not going to be as bad guided as in the States. We've spoken about him so many times since I've been on the show, and it keeps getting worse. Sometimes you get the feeling that he really wants to, just take one more step to really remind everybody that he's still there, as crazy as ever, and as lunatic as ever. That's not a very balanced analysis of the case. But I would say that's how most people feel. Then again, as you know, and as we said, Sweden has taken a controversial sort of policy in this crisis, and the country and the government is closely, scrutinized and watched by lots of we have lots of international media on the daily press briefings from the health authorities, for example, which is good, but so it's also interesting to see how some of the people rallying for being deconfined in the States, some of the ultra-right Trump supporters. There was actually one, the ones who want to be able to move freely and all that. There was one holding up a sign saying, "Let's do as in Sweden." Now, Donald Trump has used Sweden as a bad example many times before that. So it's interesting to see which way this goes, and then all the new allies basically. But I think we can just, the conclusion is the same when it comes to Trump and the White House. They're not very well prepared for this crisis, and I do feel sorry for the people he's working with and his experts especially, because what are they going to do? Like Christopher Dick says, how are they going to deal with this? Crazy man.
The worst pandemic in decades we're dealing with. And the week began with this startling piece of news. The price of oil dipping into negative territory for U.S. crude at one point. That's because, well, the storage facilities were full and there's nowhere to put the oil anymore. Delphine Minuit in Iran, the country of your roots. What does this mean? This bottoming out of the price of oil, down 73% in the past year.
Yes, as much as it can be a good news for countries such as Turkey, Turkey, which is a consuming country, this is very bad news for other countries. I'm first thinking about Iraq. It may create a bigger gap between the very poor and the very rich. It may create more social unrest, more political tensions, and definitely it will also hurt Iran even more than it was already being hurt. Since the beginning of the new U.S. sanctions, the price, the production has already drastically dropped from 2.5 million barrels a day to around 140,000 barrels per day. So definitely Iran will be affected. Interestingly, it's important to remind that Iran, along the last months and along the last years, have been trying to adapt to the situation, have been trying to diversify its economy. But if you look at the new budget, that's the problem too. Now the new budget, when it was decided, it made a very optimistic anticipation in terms of the crude prices. So there's going to be a big, huge impact, and it will definitely affect the budget deficit of the coming months and coming years.
And in Nemtsova, there's sort of this three-way battle going on, right, between Russia, Saudi Arabia, and the United States. What's the view in Moscow? I know we've talked a lot about the fact that the Russians have put aside money for a rainy day. They have strong foreign currency reserves. Are they hurting?
Well, see, Russia is an exception among other oil states. Paradoxically, Russia's been saved by sanctions. And the Kremlin has been preparing for a couple of years for a big crisis or for new sanctions, putting money aside. There are $600 billion in Russia's so-called stabilization fund, which Putin is not in a hurry to use to save small and middle business. Business actually expects some more help from the government, but there is a big concern. And the key question, like politically, we have the key question whether the civilian state, police state, will help to prevent the spread of coronavirus. Here, economically, our key question is whether Vladimir Putin's priority is going to be his friends, oligarchs, somebody like Igor Sechin and his Rosneft, rather than ordinary, average, small and middle businesses.
We saw with the 2008 crisis, Christopher Dickey, that people are still bitter about the fact that the banks were saved before the small businesses. This drop in the price of oil, what does it mean?
Well, it's very tough on the markets because people have gotten used to certain kind of stability, or at least fairly medium range oil prices. It's not going to help people. Normally, you would say it's going to help a lot in the United States. It would help small businesses. It would help people traveling on vacation during the summer. But with everybody locked down, nobody's driving anywhere anyway, not to any great extent. So I think it's going to be very hard to figure out how this works. What I expect is probably going to happen is that we have seen the end of peak oil. We have seen oil prices as high as they will ever go. They will now get back up somewhere probably into the $30, $40 range, but they are not going to go back up into the $80, $90, $100 range. And as a result, or the reason for that, is that people are finding alternatives to the use of oil. What we're doing right now, the kind of video conferencing, that's going to become much more ubiquitous in the future. People are going to be much more reluctant to travel just for business purposes than they were in the future. So I think we're going to be looking at a whole new world of less demand for oil and lower prices for oil, and that will have knock-on effects in all kinds of places, from the Dakotas, where fracking isn't going to be very economical anymore, to the Middle East, where governments that relied on oil to maintain stability by basically subsidizing all kinds of things for their people, all of that's going to be much more difficult for them to do. It will have an earth-shaking effect over the medium term, I'm sure.
All right. Before we go, the news cycle has been dominated from end to end by one story the last 2-3 months. So we decided that we're going to try to talk about overlooked stories. On Thursday in the debate, we had someone from Yemen telling us that the ceasefire that was announced by Saudi Arabia beginning of April hasn't happened. Both sides to blame for that one. Let's go around the room, the virtual room, if you will, and begin in Istanbul. Delphine Minoui, what's your overlooked story of the week?
For me, it's definitely this very historical trial that started yesterday in Germany for the first time since the beginning of the uprising against the regime of Bashar al-Assad in 2011. Some responsibles for the war crimes have been put on trial, and it started yesterday. It's going to last for a few months, maybe for years. But it's unprecedented, and it's very important not to forget about what's happening. And despite the coronavirus crisis, I mean, there had been debate about delaying it, changing the date. But at the end of the day, everybody decided to keep it on. So I was following it closely yesterday by distance. The lawyers who were inside the courtroom were explaining me that there was a limited number of seats because of the epidemic. Everybody was behind sort of a plexiglass window. Two of the main suspects were out there. I mean, they are accused of supervising and conducting repetitive acts of torture inside a jail in Damascus. Torture including electroshocks, including rape. And I was talking with families of survivors and victims, and for them, it's a turning point. It's really a turning point in terms of openly to more justice, to more transparency, and also it's the continuation and a tiny success, they say, in terms of fighting against the impunity and the immunity of Bashar al-Assad.
All right. Johanna Frunden, you heard Christopher Dickey talking about what the world will look like after COVID-19. You've been worrying about the drop in the frightening drop in the number of insects.
Well, as climate change news sort of always goes a little bit under the radar, this caught my eye because especially because experts say they're shocked. Scientists saying they're shocked is always a bad sign. Obviously, 25% of the worldwide insect habitat, or the worldwide insects, have disappeared in the last 30 years. Now it's obviously a huge ecological change, and we probably don't realize to what point we're dependent on insects pollinating and other animals feeding on them, and how crucial they are for the ecosystems. So yeah, this caught my eye, and I'm afraid that we will see these kind of news in the coming months, and they will go completely under the radar because we are so uptaken by the coronavirus. But the rest of the world, especially the animal world, keeps happening, keeps going on, and it's still very much bad news out there.
Still very much bad news. The death of insects, the death of the movie theater, says Anna Nemtsova in Moscow. Anna, as more and more people during this confinement period have been binge watching TV series and going, of course, away from the movie theaters, it's not just through streaming services like Netflix. It's also been on newer forms of social media like Zoom. Let's take a listen.
Я хочу сделать спектакль. Срепетировать его на карантине, пока все сидят дома. И как только карантин заканчивается, бац, на тарелочке зрителю выдаем готовый продукт.
Да, я ссут. Сейчас все высут.
Я так соскучилась.
Дома сидеть, это апокалипсис.
Пишем комментарий и ставим лайки.
Anna, what was that?
So this TV series made on Zoom, as you could see, called Madness, as Russian actors, thousands and thousands of Russian actors are going bananas, going mad. All theaters are closed. Bolshoi Theater, the main theater of Russia, the country, the land of Stanislavski and Chekhov, has been closed down weeks ago. And every week, Bolshoi Theater is losing up to $1 million a week. The head of the theater says it's scary to think what will happen if the theater doesn't reopen before September. Some movie theaters are never going to reopen, and some small theaters are already dead. This is very sad, but Russians cannot live without their drama and their movies. And many people watch movies on Netflix or films made like this one on Zoom.
Christopher Dickey, you saluted in a piece for the Daily Beast the passing of legendary photographer Peter Beard, whose death we learned of this past week. He was known both for his original take on African wildlife and for making headlines in the gossip pages of newspapers.
Well, everybody wrote about the gossip pages of newspapers, of page 6, as we say in the United States. And I thought, having met Beard once and having spent a lot of time in East Africa back in the early 90s, I thought people were missing what was really the most important message of his life and his work, which was that it's extremely difficult to have wildlife and humans coexisting, and you have to manage the situation much better than has been done traditionally. And sometimes that means limiting human activity, and sometimes it means limiting, even culling, populations of elephants and other animals. So I thought I would write about that. And I think the key takeaway from it, from an interview I did with Peter Beard back in 1996, which was very prescient, where he was talking about the death of tens of thousands of elephants in Tsavo West Game Park in Kenya because of mismanagement. And he said it was all the result of density and stress. And he says that's the elephant metaphor for human life in New York or in China or in many other places. Density and stress, he emphasized. And density and stress is, in fact, exactly what we're looking at now as a result of a plague that nobody had anticipated.
Christopher Dickey in Paris, I want to thank you. I want to thank as well Delphine Minoui in Istanbul, Johanna Frenden in Gothenburg, Sweden, Anna Nemtsova in Moscow. Thank you for joining us here in The World This Week. You can subscribe once again to our YouTube channel or follow us on Facebook. And there's more on France24.com.
At a time when most of humanity is confined because of COVID-19, France 24, more than ever before, is your window onto the world.
Liberté, égalité, actualité.